one more time too while we're at it.
All right. Hey everybody. It's me, it's Saul. We got a big show today. Holy mackerel. I don't know if you guys have heard what's going on in the world. There's this thing called COVID, and it's changed everything. You might call it a game changer. We're starting a couple minutes early. I couldn't wait. But it's almost 11 o'clock. So let's get going. Today on the show, holy mackerel. Jason Rodriguez. Jason and I have been friends for more than a decade, and I don't think we've ever really talked about his day job before.
No.
So I won't do it justice. I'm going to let Jason tell people what do you do? And
yeah, that's a great question. So let's see. Thank you for having me. First of all, got to be gracious. So for about 15 years or so, maybe 16 years now, I develop human response models, medical planning, logistics kind of stuff for a variety of agencies, essentially. So the easy way to kind of explain it with some, more pop culture touch points is, it's getting out of date now, but remember back like when 24 was a TV show, obviously, right? And Jack Bauer would run out and do all these crazy things. That's not me. But he would have CTU back and they would like tell him where to go and all this, yada, yada. That's also not me. I was the guy who would make the stuff that would be on the screens that CTU was using. And occasionally maybe someone I worked with would get kidnapped and get like a finger cut off or something like that. So that's basically where I exist in that world. So really a lot of like, advanced planning kind of work. What's some bad stuff that can happen? How would we treat people? How would we communicate with the population? All that kind of jazz is sort of the work that I do as my day job.
Hi, so like modeling is, or pandemic modeling or medical response and all this stuff. Modeling is like a word that, like people don't really understand. Like what does even modeling mean?
Yeah. So, I mean, let's see. So basically, you have things that happen every day in the real world, right? Like it could be just, someone gets up in the morning, goes to work, drinks their coffee, whatever. I don't know. It doesn't take terrible examples. For the most part, it's trying to figure out, mathematical, physical, biological, physiological, et cetera, representations of what is happening in the real world. And then putting it into a computer program so that people can make decisions on it is kind of where I lay. I mean, some people don't do it for decision making, but so it's a lot of just, doing just, so in my world, we do a lot of human physiology modeling. So even like down to the cellular level, what happens to a cell when a body gets sick or when a chemical enters the body? How does, different cells react and how does that kind of build up to different organ systems and in the body as a whole, and how do you treat that person? So it's doing all that on a computer so that, you could run simulations. You can give the tools to people who need to make decisions so that they could, make informed decisions and go out and actually treat things that happen in real time and do crisis management. So that's kind of that's what modeling is and how it interacts in my world. But there's a whole bunch of before this, I used to work in acoustics. So it really depends on kind of what field you're working in.
Cool. So you're my COVID-19 expert, and so like you're almost like my personal link to the real information. How you became that? I know you weren't thinking of me when you started this, but you've been blogging for about 3 months as as someone in the know who had an opinion on COVID, and obviously all your opinions are your own, and you're not speaking for the U.S. government or anything like that. But why'd you start blogging about it, and how far into your blogging did you actually start working? You were no longer an outsider looking in. You were someone who was actually working on a solution or at least a plan.
Yeah. So it's actually been 5 months, man. Time is out of control. I think it was actually, March 12th was the first post I put up. And so, I mean, historically, I've done a lot of models and plans for different types of pandemics. So I've done some work back in the day for like H5N1 influenza, and we've done some Ebola modeling and stuff like that. So I have had some insight into, the medical logistics of hopefully stopping a pandemic, but then, what you could do during a pandemic, essentially. So I wasn't working COVID at all, because again, it's much more in advanced planning. If things are already happening, it's kind of a little too late for me to do some of the stuff I do, because, it takes generally months to turn around something, but the reason why I started blogging was my dad was visiting, and we were just talking about it, and this was like early March timeframe, and he was of the, and he's in New York, by the way, which got hit really bad, and he was of the impression that, I mean, how bad is it really going to get, and we'll see it coming and all this. And I was trying to explain to him the concept of like exponential functions and how you just don't see them coming necessarily. And particularly with a focus on my grandmother, who is in like a senior center in Buffalo, New York, and just really wanting him to understand that the family needs a contingency plan. So I was telling him this, and he understood. And I was like, you know what? There's probably a lot of people who don't understand the necessity of having a contingency plan right now. So the first post I put up was one that was basically, look, in the coming weeks, it is very possible that we're going to have to spend some time indoors. And you should really focus on protecting like your immunocompromised and elderly family members. And I'm not saying you have to go and pull them out of a home right now, but you should absolutely have a plan for when things start like really reaching a tipping point. That tipping point was about a week after that post. But, for the most part, it was me just trying to like passive aggressively shame my family into taking care of grandma, but also seeing if anyone else would maybe want to hear the same story.
So you've done 11 blog posts on the topic, and some of the blog post titles have been "Should You Panic?" "The Mathematics of Pandemics," "Why Are We Staying Home?" "On Severity and Case Fatality Rates," "When Are You Contagious?" "What Does It Mean to Quarantine?" Like these are very like real world serious topics. What have the response been?
The response has been actually pretty great. When I mean, like, there's great in that people are reading it, and then there's great in that people are getting something from it. So, I don't think my audience is in the thousands, but it's certainly folks that are then passing off the articles they're reading to their family members who are maybe getting news from like a not as trustworthy source. So what I tried to do from the outset was, just try to make like very clear, concise blog posts that explain science in a way that almost anyone can understand it. My partner, Liz Larrabee, edits the site. She is not a scientist, so everything goes through her. And if anything is not understandable, she calls me out on it and I make changes. But also to try to be as like truthful and honest as possible and be like, look, things could get bad. Like back, I think like the second or third post I did, that case fatality rate one, that was a big one, because that was when folks were saying how, it wasn't that fatal of a disease or as bad as influenza. And I tried to explain, when we do this type of modeling, the thing we always worry about is running out of a critical resource, because your chance of dying is actually pegged almost entirely to whether or not you have the one or two super critical things you need to survive. And for COVID, it was going to be ventilators. And that was one of the things I said is like, you can't judge the fatality rate now. You have to wait until hospitals start getting overrun. And then people also having to make decisions on who gets a ventilator and who doesn't. And that's a really ugly place to get to. So you want to flatten the curve so you don't get there, et cetera. We didn't do that, especially not in New York and Jersey. And, there were people making some really terrible decisions for the most part. So, anyway, so that was kind of what I wanted to do. Is I wanted to be honest. I wanted to be clear and concise. And I certainly wanted to try to reach as many people as possible without being political. That was another thing too, is that a lot of my friends said, oh, well, we sent it to our Republican like aunt and uncle who just like, listen, like read Breitbart all the time. And I'm like, great, because there's no politics in here. This is just science. I mean, you can't politic your way out of science for the most part, although sometimes we're pretty good at it, but.
So your posts, I've read all of them. I've shared probably half of them. I found them fascinating. To me, as someone who's not scientific, layperson, they were easily to understand, but they were fascinating and interesting, but also they were scary. Like, there's a lot in there to really make you think. And that, I literally took something from everyone, but the one that I actually copy and pasted and emailed to probably 40 people was the post titled "No Amount of Bullshit Can Bury It." Such a fascinating thought process. But can you talk a little bit about that post? And you can
Yeah.
even read it if you want. We can make this a beat poetry session. But
Well, I don't,
talk
I
about that,
don't
that
have it open.
post.
I'm not going to read it, but I
Mhm.
could certainly do my best to talk to it, right? So, I mean, the phrase itself. So, the way I set up in that post is occasionally when things go bad, right? You just get into these huddle sessions, or you talk to people who are actually working the problem, and sometimes they come up with something that just really sticks with you too. So that was one of those phrases that stuck with me. And in my original post, I called back to, I had some folks who were doing, real time response and modeling for the Fukushima incident in Japan. And I remember someone saying, basically, we planned for a tsunami and we planned for an earthquake, but we never planned for both. And to me, that was like this eye-opening thing where it's like, oh, okay, right. I mean, you can never plan for every single contingency. Sometimes multiple things are going to happen and you can't do anything about it. For this one, I was listening to a briefing on COVID projections, and they were going state by state by some of the states that were looking pretty bad, and Florida was one of them on there. And the projections they had at the time were just off the charts, ridiculous. And I remember a colleague of mine saying that was a number so big that no amount of bullshit can bury it. And that was just such a profound thing to hear in a way, right? Because it's true. Like, you could try to hide data, you could try to do everything you want, but if you get to a point where statistically speaking, every single person in a state is going to know someone who's sick, and then probably everyone's going to know someone who's going to die, you get to a point where the media can no longer control that narrative, right? Like no organization can control that narrative. That narrative is out, and there's nothing you can do about it. So that's kind of where that phrase came from, and I love it. I mean, honestly, the Florida numbers have turned in a different direction, which thank God. There's theories about like self-limiting epidemics for the most part. Plague is a great example, where it's something that if it ever happens in the real world, it'll spread so quickly. But anyone who's contagious looks like they have plague, so that you just stay away from that person. And I do feel like we might see something similar here on a population level where, even if people are not wearing masks, or, 40, 50% of the population is not wearing masks, and even if people aren't believing all the science, there is still some like subconscious level to kind of stay alive. And just in doing that, you may just make a decision every once in a while to maybe not go out on a Friday night, or you may just make a decision to not get too close to somebody, or, do that joking thing where it's like, oh, I guess I'm not shaking hands, right? We'll bump elbows. So like, I feel like you see some of that when things start to get really bad. And I think a lot about things, it may be going that way sometimes. It's hard to say. I mean, schools are opening now, so everything's going to change. And we'll see how it goes. But
Well,
yeah,
so schools, like that's a major conversation. And in the U.S., of course, you're in Washington, I'm in Toronto. Our schools don't open until after Labor Day, so we still have a couple weeks. But there's lots of conversation in the news and about, I personally don't think the plan is very well thought out to send kids back to school. And in Toronto, it's just going to be business as usual. Kids wear masks, teachers wear masks. They're going to go to school for half the day, and then the rest of it is going to be online learning. As far as I'm concerned, like, just if you're only going to send your kid for an hour and a half, why bother? But but it's still going to be full classes. They're still going to be shoulder to shoulder. There's going to be no separation or anything like that. And it just, it seems not very well thought out. I know you have an opinion on schools, and like we'll try to keep this as politically agnostic as possible, because it doesn't do any justice. But just based on the science, like what is the most commonsensical plan to send kids back to school, if at all? Like and I know I'm rambling, this is part of my interview style. One thing I saw on Twitter was somebody proposed having a national television station where every kid gets the same curriculum, same everything. That seemed brilliant to me. I don't know why that isn't being done like instantly. But where's your head around kids going back to school and schools opening?
I mean, I think it's going to happen. I mean, first of all, just to do a slight correction on something you said. You said it was business as usual in Toronto, but like you said, they have masks. It's hard to keep a mask on a kid, but there also is part virtual learning. There are some steps that in a way can kind of reduce that susceptible population in a school. They're not perfect.
Oh, but when I said business as usual, some of the rumors of the changes were going to be, reduced class size,
Right,
cohorts of 15, kids stay in the class and only the teachers move, and you pretty
right,
much like interlock with 15 kids and you'll spend the entire day with them. Like there were some things that, at least, whether they were rumor or just shot down, they were things that it seemed like someone had put a great deal of thought into it. And
sure.
then they just said, okay, still 30 kids per class, but don't worry, they'll be wearing a mask and they'll go for 90 minutes and go home. If you were going to look at these things on a spectrum, they're pretty much on the opposite ends of the
Yes, I agree.
spectrum.
I agree. No, I definitely agree with that. But anyway, to get to the actual question, sorry,
Yeah.
we got to tune in for correctness a little bit there. But to get to the actual, I mean, I just feel like it's one of those things that we had so much time to figure out a better plan. Like it was like if we gave up our spring, we could have had our summer. If we gave up our summer, we could have had our fall. As a population, there wasn't really a very strong concerted effort to do that. So as of right now, we have a lot of sick people mixed into a population. Kids can get sick. Ultimately, that's not going to be the problem. That's never the reason why when we do these models, we close schools. I mean, granted, if it's a smallpox or something like that, yeah, we don't want 35% of our children dying or anyone dying. But with something like this, where there's a lower incidence of severity, of severe manifestation of the illness in children, the real reason why you close schools is then to protect their parents and their guardians, right? Because a lot of those kids, they're going to pick up this disease at school, where even if they're wearing masks or a teacher's wearing masks, or a teacher could probably still get sick, most likely a lot of them will, but then they're going to go home and they're going to get their parents sick and their grandparents sick and a lot of people in their community sick. And that's really the problem, is now you're kind of have these little like packages of illness that are now bringing it into what you've been trying to keep as a sort of austere environment where there's no sick people in that place, right? So it totally just breaks the concept of your quarantine for the most part. And, as a result of that, you're going to start seeing a lot of older Americans and other, wherever else they open schools, like, without any regard whatsoever to safety protocols, you're going to start seeing a lot of the guardians probably getting sick and dying. And I think that's the point where people are going to have to say, okay, well, we blew it again. Let's like ditch our fall and hopefully have a good winter. I mean, that's what's going to come down to. We're just going to keep giving up seasons until we get, I guess, the vaccine is our strategy. So I don't know. That's my thought. I mean, there's inevitability to all this, is my opinion, right? So one of the stories I told on the blog, and it's true, this was for my company, we have like this yearly leadership conference. And I was invited to be a co-MC with like someone else. And, we just had to like, write funny skits and do some stand-up, whatever, yada, yada. So we were working on it. And then, sometime in like mid-February to late February, I just slowed down. I didn't really care. And at one point he writes me a message. I think it was either late February or early March, like, give or take a day. And it was basically like, we really need to like step up on this. And what's the plan? I'm like, honestly, this is all going to get canceled. And at that point, there's only like maybe 50 people sick in the States. And he was like, what do you mean? I'm like, it's just going to get canceled. This is the numbers, the projections are out of control. No one's doing anything. It's inevitable. Like, there's no way they can keep this conference on. There's no way we're going to be going into the office by the end of March. There's no way any of this stuff is going to happen. It's absolutely inevitable at this point. And that's kind of the way I feel about school closings, is they're going to open them up. They're going to try the best they can. And I think that it's going to be inevitable that they close down, unless there's some factor that we're not considering or we don't know about. It's a new disease. Things happen. It's just, there's nothing you can do. It's just, it's just going to close. That's it.
Knowing everything that you know and having the information that's available to you, how do you function as a human? You kind of see all the bad in the world.
I go to therapy. I've been going to therapy since I was 16. Big fan of therapy. Shout out to therapy. But it's funny. We joke. I mean, we have a super morbid sense of humor in the office. Even with even though I was saying like that conference that it was inevitable that it was going to end. We started, just in case it was, I started writing jokes in the event that they did try to open it, right? And it was basically like, one of them would be like, thank you all for coming out. This is a really tough time. Thankfully, this disease only really kills like older people. Oh shit, because we got all these old people in leadership. You know what I mean? ending it by like, thanks for coming. Hope to see you all next year. Well, maybe not 5% of yous. So, we kind of like, we're a morbid bunch for the most part. There is a point that we kind of joke about in my office, at least, that we call it like when you get your first nuclear nightmare. And it's basically a dream that's so like crazy and vivid and destructive that like you just wake up in cold sweats. And for me, it was a nuclear one first, where it's like, I'm here, there's a bomb here, and someone I love is over here. And it was a recurring nightmare I would have, where it's like, what do you do about it? So eventually those start to go away, and then you just adopt a morbid sense of humor. You go to therapy. Everyone should go to, I mean, even that me, Paul, I used to hope you go to therapy. Everyone should go to therapy.
I love the attention. Somebody listens to me talk.
So, I mean, yeah. And, just open communication. I don't know. I mean, part of me also likes the fact that I feel like we do good work, right? Like, current crisis, forget the current crisis. There was certainly a lot that we did a great job, and plans were made and plans were followed. And, we kind of were able to limit things. So, I'm driven by doing good work. That helps.
That's cool. I'm going to read you a tweet that you wrote. So
okay.
I'm going to read it so we get accuracy here, because I was fascinated by this. But you tweeted, when we're doing mass casualty response planning, we often include models where the Postal Service delivers countermeasures and even vaccines. They're the only system that visits every house in America every day. They're a logistical miracle. Anyway, that seems relevant. Love you to talk about that. And I'm going to make a bad joke and say, yes, the Postal Service is incredible, but man, like I'm still waiting like for a week late on something that was supposed to be delivered because everyone's back. But talk about using the Postal Service, because that's something I would have never thought of, and that's kind of brilliant. So talk a little bit about that.
That's kind of the things we do, right? Like we usually sit around a lot in these sort of focus groups, and we just think through, different outside of the box ideas that could be used if things get really bad. And the Postal Service I'm not lying. It's a logistical miracle. I mean, it seems to be having maybe some issues now. But it is an organization that every single day it visits is capable of visiting every single house in America. Like, what else? There's nothing else that does that. Garbage men don't even do that, right? Because they only come like once a week or so. It's the only organization that actually does that. So it's the type of infrastructure that, when we sit around and we think about what happens if we need to get, 250 million courses of some antibiotic out to people, which is a lot, right? Like, how do you do that? Do you X people to come to a central location? Let's say it's a contagious disease like we have right now. Do you ask people to come to a central location where they're going to be exposed to people who are already infectious, line up, wait, get shots, do whatever it takes, and then go back home? That vaccine isn't going to be instantly. It's not like the vaccine isn't this magical thing where it breaks your skin and all of a sudden you're never going to get sick. A lot of vaccines, they take a couple of days to kind of ramp up that immune response for starters. A lot of them take booster shots. At first, that first shot might only be 40-50% effective. So it's sometimes it's either you line everybody up or you start putting in systems into place where you actually slow down the distribution of the vaccine, and you give people, you come in this 10-minute window, or you do the drive-through car thing, whatever it is, but it slows the whole process down. Now you're talking about, vaccinating the United States, and it could take months. It could take months to do it. Or if you had like an auto injector or something that someone could just like sniff, like a nasally induced delivered system, you could get that to every single house in America, like the day after it's available. That is a fascinating logistical like miracle that, when you sit around and you think about these kind of ideas, people are like, yeah, that would be the best way to possibly do it. So yeah, it's just one of the, a lot of times you hear someone come up with something like that. That's just like, yep, that's definitely the way you have to do it. Now, I'm not saying it's possible. There's always going to be roadblocks. A lot of the pushback you get with that kind of stuff is, a lot of these things need to be prescribed. A lot of these things, people could take them incorrectly. They maybe don't understand the labels. There's misinformation all over the internet. It could be, there could be a video post on YouTube saying, take all 90 courses as this antibiotic on day one for super like immunity, or something like that. And, then you'll die. So, I mean, there's a lot of pushback on like those types of ideas. But I've always been of the opinion that, you could like find a million reasons why something's a bad idea. But if it's the difference between, 100, 200, a million people dying and not doing that, you're going to find a way to make it work because you have to. That's just my opinion. And we'll see what happens when we get a vaccine sometime. I mean, I am optimistic that we could see one later this year or early next year for sure. I am.
So again, this is all your own opinion. You're not speaking on behalf of the US government or any organization. But what do you think the next 2 months look like, or next 3 months look like? Like we're coming out of summer, we're heading into fall, which is usually traditionally like, well, flu season is usually a little closer to January, February and stuff like that. But like, we've been hearing wave 2 forever, but we're not really out of wave 1 yet. So it's like, what do the next 3 months look like? Am I still going to be sitting in my basement working? Can I go out? Like, I feel like people on Tinder miss me. Like, what does the world look like in your opinion, high level?
So yeah, I personally think there's no reason to believe it's not going to be bad. I think mask adoption is certainly increasing, and that's great. I think we all got masks wrong. Not the whole world, but America certainly got masks wrong. I mean, going back to March, I was one of those people who was like, yeah, I mean, it gives you like a false sense of security, and as soon as you take it off, you have shit all over your hands, and you're going to touch your face and all this stuff. Quickly changed my opinion on that one. One of the first analyses I did for COVID was early April, looking at masks. And I was like, oh yeah, no, that was a ridiculous opinion to have. That was based not at all on reality. So, I do think that is something that they're correct. Like they being, CDC and other folks, and even some of my own models, and is that it could definitely make things not terrible. But there are certain jurisdictions, areas, countries where mask adoption is much slower, much lower percentage of people doing it. You go to fall, you have more people kind of cozying up indoors with sweaters, and not sweaters necessarily right off the bat, but you can have more people in close quarters going to festivals and all that stuff and yada yada, and you're gonna have kids returning from school, like I said, and they're going to be sick, and once you kind of get that into the families, it's going to just increase from there. So again, I don't see any reason to think the fall's not going to be bad. But I've been wrong. People have been wrong. I would rather err on the side of caution. So Saul, sorry, I think you're going to be staying home. I'm staying home. I mean, I haven't gone out at all really in 5 months. That's crazy.
I go to the grocery store. I go check in on my parents, and that's about it. I walk the dog a couple times a day, but I'm wearing a mask, and it's so funny. And maybe I'm like, paranoid or whatever, but like even watching TV, or TV doesn't bother me that much when I see people all hugging, but man, I doom scroll through Instagram and I see people hugging and all sorts of stuff, and it makes me curious whether these are people in their bubble and stuff like that. Like, it's just my brain has been completely rewired to like self-preservation and stuff like that, which is probably a good thing.
It's a good thing. Yeah.
Two more questions, and I give you your day back. You got your Washington Nationals hat on. You're a huge baseball fan. How weird is it watching baseball right now? Like it's so bizarre. And then like I almost feel like baseball should not be being played right now. And I love baseball, but at least basketball has a bubble and hockey has a bubble. This whole like the Cardinals just aren't going to play for a week and stuff like that. Like it's pretty bizarre, and I don't get it.
Yeah, it's bananas. Like the Cardinals have played 5 games so far, I think it is.
Something like that.
It's not funny. I had a prediction that it would last 2 weeks. I'm wrong. So we're going into are we going into our 4th week now? 3rd week? 4th week?
I think it'll, as long as the owners are getting money, it'll keep going. Like
they're gonna limp past the finish line. But no, I mean, the bubble idea for basketball was a fantastic idea. I think sports are
Hmm.
important to, it does give people something to do.
Hmm.
Your first question is, how is it watching baseball? I don't watch baseball. I listen to it. I'm a radio guy. I'm old school. I'll even sometimes
That's
just listen
cool.
to it, yeah, with like a little scorebook.
Hmm.
So on the radio broadcast, when they pipe in the fake audience noise, it almost sounds like a real broadcast. It's
Hmm.
actually the only thing that throws it off is when the commentators, they talk about who's missing because of COVID or whatever it is. So
Hmm.
that's like what brings you back to reality. No, I mean, personally, I think it was a little irresponsible to open. I had this opinion that was basically, well, they're going to do it. It's inevitable that they're going to stop doing it. So I'm going to enjoy it while I can. And I've been able to enjoy it still. So it's good. I like watching the Nats beat up on the Mets right now. I'm an ex-Met fan. So it's
Hmm.
my dad's watching this. He's probably cursing me right now. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. We had a championship last year, that was like,
Hmm.
man, last October was like one of the best months of like my life, man. We like got the championship and like I got engaged and like all this like great stuff happened. And then November was, December holidays, etc. went through Budapest. And then, all of a sudden news started coming out in January and the reality of it started being real in February. And then March was just,
Okay. Um, Last question. Like I think I tweeted at you and said you're my favorite person on the internet right now. Between your COVID posts, which I rely on to stay sane and have information from someone I trust, you tweeted a really amazing story about Representative John Lewis. John Lewis, who of course passed away. I don't know, maybe it's about 2 weeks ago now. Can you, and I know without the visual, it doesn't do it as great justice, but I'd love to hear kind of the John Lewis story from your mouth and your side of things. Cause it was, when John Lewis passed away, there was, a lot of people who were sharing stories about him at Comic-Con. And there was a lot of people who were sharing stories about, just like really fascinating guy who I'll admit, I didn't know a whole lot about, probably until the last 6 months of his life, but I could blame it on being Canadian. So I'm not going to pretend I was in early on John Lewis, but I'd love to hear your story because it was very cool.
Well, so as you mentioned, it at least insinuated, John Lewis was a co-writer on a comic book called March.
Mm-hmm.
It was a series of 3 graphic novels. Well, not a graphic novel because it was true. So what do we call that? Graphic nonfiction. He co-wrote it with Andrew Aiden, was on John Lewis's staff. It was illustrated by Nate Powell. Tremendous work. Won the National Book Award. Very like everyone reads it. Now I know both of those guys, not John Lewis, but I knew Andrew Aiden and Nate Powell because I made comics too. So I kind of knew him through that community. And this was probably about maybe 2 or 3 years ago at this point. But we had I was an Airbnb host for a while. It was one of those things where I was like kind of living on my own for the first time in a long time. I was like having just like some really weird dreams about like home invasion and stuff. And back to my therapist, they're like, you should open up your house and you should like host people to make it like a home again. I was like, great idea. I'll host on Airbnb. And he was like, that's a little going too far, but fine. Do whatever you got to do. So I like listed my guest bedroom on Airbnb. I made it the cheapest guest bedroom in all of Arlington. I was like, I just want people to come to this house and meet people. And one of the guests we had was this kid. And this is the worst part is like, I don't even remember his name. Like, I'm sure I could find it, but like, I don't remember the kid's name or the mom's name. There was no like follow up, but he came to stay here and the mom, they came from Tennessee. They drove and the mom was like, yeah, we just finished reading March. And, Connor, maybe it was Connor. Anyway, he was inspired by John Lewis and he wanted to try to meet him. So she was like, okay, we'll just drive to DC and see if we could make that happen, which is like such a bananas thing. But also, I remember when I was around that age, I fell in love, well, a little older because I was reading, but I fell in love with Stephen King. And my parents were like, well, let's drive to Bangor and see if we could see Stephen King. So like, I don't know, sometimes parents do that, right?
I want to meet Dolly Parton. I'm going to get in my car right now.
So anyway, so they drive to DC, they check in at the place and she tells me, the mom tells me why she's here. And I'm like, oh man, I bet you I could make this happen, basically. So I didn't even necessarily tag Andrew. I knew he would see it. I wrote about them on Facebook. I didn't want to be like too, obvious about it. And Andrew is a sweetheart. He's like great. And he's the co-writer for March. So within like an hour, he messaged me and he's like, I'm going to see what I can do. And then he got in touch with the mom. And yeah, they went to the office and he got to meet, John Lewis. There's like this great picture they sent me of the two of them in his office, like looking at John Lewis's wall of like memorabilia from the civil rights movement and all this stuff. And yeah, he just came back and he was like completely inspired. They ended up sending another day here. And I hung out with him. We just like drew comics for a long time and talked about different things and did some reading, and I gave him some recommendations. Yeah, he's like this 8-year-old kid. And I think this. I'm trying to remember I remember the line because I wrote it down and I had it in the Twitter thread you were talking about. But he said something along the lines of like, when John Lewis was his age, John Lewis knew that he was like going to do something important for the world, and he, as this like 8-year-old kid, kind of felt the same way. So he wanted to meet him, and like to me, that's just like and honestly, like, he's like a white kid from Tennessee, right? So like, even that is like, this white kid from Tennessee, like reads about the civil rights struggle and reads about John Lewis. And he's like, that is my hero. Like that to me is just, it goes to show like the inclusiveness of his message and the importance of his work and what he's done for this world. And it was just really great to help that kid, meet a hero, basically. It was definitely one of my top 3 Airbnb guests. For sure. It was wonderful.
That's awesome. Jason, you have been amazing. I appreciate you being generous with your time. Tell people where to read your blog, how to get in touch with you if you want that sort of stuff, where to buy your books. We didn't really even talk about, but Jason has, edited and written some really amazing graphic novels and comic books. Give like the elevator pitch for Postcards, because that's my favorite.
Postcards was so long ago. It's in Remainders. You'll never find it in the stores, but that was one of the first anthologies I did. And basically, I collect used postcards. I collected used postcards from like, the early 1900s. And the idea was, you give a used postcard to a comics artist and you say, can you finish the story on this, right? Because the first one I saw that made me realize this was a good idea was there was one I found. It was like 1944, 43, whatever. And it was someone who was getting shipped off to fight in World War II. And he was writing his mom. And he was like, basically like, I'll be back. Everything's great. And in my mind, I was like, man, this guy could have died, right? And this could be like the last thing that he's ever kind of captured of who he is. That's in the public record. This piece of ephemera that like I found at like a used antique store for like an antique store for like 10 cents, right? Because no one cares about used postcards. They're considered like damaged. So yeah, so that was the idea, was like just collect all these postcards and like try to have people flesh out their lives like in a way that they saw it. So yeah, that was the first one. I've kind of since then gotten much more into nonfiction books, social justice kind of stuff. I did a series of history books called Colonial Comics, which tried to focus a little bit more on some of the untold stories from American history and untold people, focusing a bit on people of color and women and things that we don't normally talk about in these stories. I did a book called Artists Against Police Brutality back in 2016, co-edited with John Jennings and Bill Campbell. And that's exactly what it sounds like. It was right after the officers who killed Eric Garner, they weren't going to, the grand jury said they weren't going to press charges. We decided to do that book. I did a book recently co-edited called Voces Sin Fronteras, where we worked with a bunch of immigrant youth to help them, taught them how to make comics even, and then help them publish their live stories in comic book form. So I do a lot of stuff that doesn't really sell well, but is pretty meaningful to me. I love it. You can find almost all that on Amazon or your local bookstore, preferably your local bookstore if you can. And then anything you need on me is on jasonrodriguez.com. So my name is spelled right there, Jason Rodriguez, and just put a .com at the end. There's another Jason Rodriguez who's like also a writer. He does like books on how to like email people or something. He's like a tech writer. I'm not that guy. I do other things. So just so you know.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. This has been amazing. I will continue to follow everything you do online, but I really appreciate you doing this.
All right. Well, thank you, Saul. It was great. And, let me know if you have anything other questions for me, I guess.